Buck Wyatt found her at dawn, hanging from the cottonwood at the edge of his property. Not dead, not yet. The sign nailed above her read, "White man don't forgive," crude letters burned into splintered wood. 3 years of solitary ranching in the New Mexico territory had taught Buck to mind his own business. The girl was Apache, maybe 12 years old, her face battered, her breathing shallow. Military brass buttons clutched in her small hand caught the morning light. He recognized those buttons. Captain Hollister's unit. Buck's hand moved to the scar across his neck, a reminder of why he'd walked away from scouting for the Army, why he'd chosen this isolated existence. Getting involved meant risking everything he'd built. In the distance, dust clouds rose, riders approaching. Buck cut the rope and caught the girl as she fell, his decision made before he'd even realized it. Some lines, once crossed, changed a man forever. The hanging tree marked a boundary between past and future for Buck Wyatt, between the man who turned away and the man who couldn't. What would you do if saving an innocent life meant risking your own? Would you stand against injustice even when the odds are stacked against you? Share your thoughts below about what makes an unlikely hero, and follow for the continuation of this tale where redemption comes at a steep price, but some debts must be paid regardless of the cost. The nightmare always ended the same, blood on his hands and Apache screams fading into the desert wind. Buck Wyatt woke with the first light, his breath coming hard and sweat cooling on his skin despite the morning chill. 3 years since he'd walked away from scouting, and still the dreams found him. He moved through his morning ritual with practiced efficiency, water hauled from the well, coffee set to boil on the iron stove, a quick check of his property's perimeter. The New Mexico desert stretched before him, painted in hues of amber and rust under the rising sun. His small ranch sat isolated at the edge of nowhere, which suited him just fine. Isolation meant safety, from memories, from judgment, from the man he used to be. The drought had taken its toll on the land. Buck studied the cracked earth beneath his boots as he walked the fence line, noting where coyotes had dug under during the night. His horse nickered softly from the corral, the only company he allowed himself these days. "Patience," he murmured, measuring out a careful portion of grain. Feed was scarce, and town was a 4-day ride he made only when absolutely necessary. As the sun climbed higher, Buck spotted movement to the east. A cluster of buzzards circling something in the distance. Probably a dead calf from McPherson's herd, wandered too far in search of water. He'd seen plenty die that way, man and beast alike. With a sigh, Buck saddled his horse. Those buzzards were circling near his eastern boundary, where a few head of his own cattle had wandered yesterday. The desert taught hard lessons about paying attention. The buzzards scattered as Buck approached, but what hung from the cottonwood wasn't dead. Not yet. A girl, small, Apache by her clothing, suspended from a thick branch by a crude rope around her chest and arms. Not a hanging meant to kill quickly, but to leave someone exposed to the elements, to suffering. Her face was bruised, dried blood crusting her nose and split lip. Her eyes were closed, but a shallow rise and fall of her chest showed life still clung to her small frame. Above her, a wooden sign had been nailed to the trunk. "White man, don't forgive." Buck sat motionless in his saddle, scanning the horizon for whoever had left this message. The area around the tree showed multiple hoof prints, military-issue horseshoes by the look of them, along with boot prints of several men. Hours old, at least. "None of my concern," Buck muttered, but made no move to leave. The Apache wars weren't his fight, not anymore. Whatever this child had done, whatever she'd seen, It would only bring trouble to a man who harbored her. The girl's eyelids fluttered, a small whimper escaping her cracked lips. Buck's hand moved to the knife at his belt, then paused. Taking her meant choosing sides in a conflict he'd walked away from years ago. Leaving her meant her death, slow and cruel under the merciless sun. "Damn it all," he growled, dismounting and moving toward the tree. The brass buttons fell from her clutched hand as Buck cut her down, catching her small body against his chest. The insignia was unmistakable. Captain Hollister's unit. Buck's stomach tightened at the sight, memories of the man's cold eyes and cruel efficiency flooding back. The girl couldn't weigh more than 70 pounds, all sinew and bone beneath her torn clothing. Up close, Buck could see the careful pattern of her wounds, not random violence, but calculated punishment. Someone had wanted her to suffer before she died. Buck wrapped her in his coat, despite the day's growing heat. His mind raced with the implications of what he was doing. Hollister wasn't a man who left loose ends. If the girl had witnessed something she shouldn't have, if those buttons were evidence of some kind, the captain wouldn't stop until she was silenced. In the distance, a dust cloud rose on the horizon, riders moving fast and heading toward his ranch. "Hang on, little one," Buck murmured, lifting her onto his horse before mounting behind her. He guided his mount toward a hidden arroyo that cut across his land, avoiding the main trail back to the ranch house. The decision was made, though Buck couldn't have said exactly when. Perhaps when he'd first seen the sign, or when he'd recognized Hollister's buttons, or maybe years earlier when he'd walked away from the army rather than participate in what he'd seen happening to the Apache people. What he did know was that whoever was coming, they'd find more than they bargained for at the Wyatt Ranch. The girl's eyes followed Buck's every move like a wounded wolf watching the hunter who spared it. She hadn't made a sound since he'd cut her down, not even when he'd cleaned the rope burns circling her arms and chest. Inside his small ranch house, Buck worked by lamplight, the windows shuttered against the afternoon heat. He dipped a clean cloth in water and gently dabbed at the cut above her eye, careful not to cause more pain. This might sting, he warned, though she'd shown no reaction to anything so far. Her dark eyes remained fixed on him, wary and calculating. She couldn't be more than 12, but those eyes had seen things no child should witness. Buck recognized that look from his scouting days, the gaze of someone who'd survived by staying alert, by anticipating danger. The water in the basin turned pink as he cleaned her wounds. Most were superficial, designed to cause pain without killing. The dehydration was more dangerous. Her lips were cracked, her skin hot to the touch. Buck offered a tin cup of water. "Small sips," he instructed, demonstrating with a gesture when she made no move to take it. After watching him carefully, she accepted the cup but didn't drink until Buck had turned away to sort through his meager medical supplies. He heard the smallest of swallows behind him. Progress. "Not gonna hurt you," Buck said softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Those cuts need cleaning or they'll fester." She remained silent, eyes tracking his every move. "Gotta call you something. Can't just say girl forever." Buck paused, feeling awkward with the one-sided conversation. "Sadie." My mother's name was Sadie. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not trust, but perhaps the faintest recognition that he was trying to help. That would have to be enough for now. Mabel Collins's visits were rare enough to mean trouble, or gossip too juicy for her to keep to herself. The sound of her wagon approaching sent Buck quickly to the bedroom door, ushering the girl inside with a finger to his lips. He'd just closed the door when Mabel's heavy knock rattled the front entrance. "Coming?" Buck called, glancing around for any signs of his unexpected guest. A small bloodied rag lay by the basin, and he stuffed it in his pocket before opening the door. Mabel stood on his porch, a basket of supplies over one arm, and suspicion written across her weathered face. At 62, she was as tough as the desert itself and twice as unforgiving of weakness. "Twice in 1 month, Buck Wyatt," she said, pushing past him. "People will talk." "Nobody out here to talk, Mabel," he replied, taking the basket. The smell of fresh bread made his stomach growl. "What brings you all this way?" Mabel's shrewd eyes scanned the room, landing on the basin of pinkish water Buck hadn't managed to dispose of. "Thought you might need supplies." Her tone made it clear she wasn't just talking about the bread. "Army's been through town, posted a bounty." Buck's hand tightened on the basket. "What kind of bounty?" $500 for an Apache girl." Mabel's voice dropped. "They're saying she murdered a soldier." "Since when does the Army pay bounties for children?" Buck kept his face carefully neutral. "Since Captain Hollister took command at the fort." Mabel shook her head. "Something don't sit right about it, Buck. Territorial Marshal was asking questions, but Hollister shut him down quick." Buck nodded, processing this information while maintaining his composure. Hollister wasn't just searching. He was willing to pay a small fortune to find the girl. Whatever she'd witnessed must be damning indeed. "Army business ain't my concern," Buck said, setting the basket on his table. Mabel's eyes narrowed. "That your blood in that basin?" "Cut myself mending fence. Nothing serious." She clearly didn't believe him, but had the good sense not to press. Instead, she lowered her voice. "Be careful, Buck. Hollister's men aren't just looking for an Apache. They're asking about folks who might be sympathetic. Your name came up." Buck recognized the lieutenant's voice, Jenkins, Hollister's obedient dog, who never questioned orders. The sound of military spurs jingling on his porch steps came minutes after Mabel's departure. "Under the floorboards," Buck whispered, quickly lifting a section of planking in the bedroom. "Stay quiet, no matter what." The girl slipped into the narrow space beneath his floor without hesitation, her movements silent and practiced. Buck replaced the boards and tossed a rug over the spot just as boots thumped on his porch. He positioned himself by the table, deliberately close to his rifle, leaning against the wall, before calling, "Doors open." Lieutenant Jenkins entered flanked by 2 privates, all 3 dusty from the trail, but maintaining military posture. Jenkins' eyes swept the small cabin with obvious disdain. "Mandatory search, Wyatt. Looking for an Apache murderer. Young girl." Buck leaned against his table, arms folded. "Since when do Apache children come onto settled land alone?" "Since this one killed Private Reynolds." Jenkins gestured for his men to begin searching. "Captain Hollister's leading the hunt personally." Buck kept his face carefully neutral. "Haven't seen any Indians." "Just Mabel Collins bringing supplies." The soldiers methodically searched the cabin, upending Buck's few possessions with practiced efficiency. One of them approached the bedroom, and Buck felt his muscles tense involuntarily. "Found anything interesting in town, Lieutenant?" he asked, deliberately drawing Jenkins' attention. "Must be something special to bring soldiers all the way out here." Jenkins studied Buck's face. "Captain remembers you, Wyatt. Says you always had a soft spot for the natives." "Captain remembers wrong. I just do my ranching and mind my business." The private emerged from the bedroom. "Nothing, sir." Jenkins nodded, clearly disappointed. "If you see anything, Wyatt, it's your duty to report it. That girl's dangerous." "A child dangerous?" Buck couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "Children can still witness things they shouldn't," Jenkins replied, his meaning unmistakable. After the soldiers departed, Buck waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before retrieving the girl from her hiding place. She emerged silently, dust clinging to her hair and clothes. Buck sighed with relief, then froze as he noticed what she'd done. There in the dust on his floor, she'd drawn a perfect copy of Hollister's unit insignia, the same insignia that had been on the buttons clutched in her hand when he'd found her. The girl hadn't spoken a word, but her message was clear. She knew exactly who was hunting her and why. The scouts' tracks were plain as day. Hollister hadn't just sent soldiers, he'd sent Apache trackers. Buck spotted the distinctive pattern at first light while checking his property's perimeter. A chill ran through him despite the morning heat. Apache trackers could find a mouse in a sandstorm. The girl wouldn't be safe here, not anymore. Inside the cabin, Buck moved with deliberate efficiency, gathering supplies and weapons. The girl, Sadie, as he'd been calling her, though she hadn't acknowledged the name, watched him from her corner, alert to the change in routine. "They'll be back by noon," Buck explained, though he didn't expect a response. "With more men, we can't stay." She stared at him silently, her dark eyes evaluating his movements. Buck laid out a rough map on the table, tracing a route with his finger. "South, to Mexico. I know people who can help." When she didn't react, he knelt to her eye level, his voice softening. "I won't let him hurt you again. Understand?" For the first time, the girl gave a slight nod, barely perceptible but unmistakable. The first real response since he'd found her. Buck packed jerky, hardtack, and dried beans into saddlebags along with his canteen and a spare blanket. He checked his Winchester rifle and Colt revolver methodically, his movements betraying years of military training. From a hidden compartment beneath his bed, he retrieved a small pouch of silver coins, emergency money he'd hoped never to need. As they prepared to leave, Buck paused at the doorway, surveying the small ranch he'd built with his own hands. 3 years of work, of hiding, of trying to forget. He knew he'd never see it again. The girl stood beside him, a small bundle of his old clothes clutched in her arms, waiting. "Let's go," Buck said, closing the door without looking back. The desert at night belonged to ghosts and memories, and those desperate enough to ride through both. Buck guided his horse along a dried creek bed, keeping to the shadows where moonlight couldn't reach. The girl sat before him, her slight body tense but steady. 3 hours of hard riding had put distance between them and the ranch, but Buck knew better than to follow the main trails. Hollister would have men watching every road south. When the moon reached its zenith, Buck stopped in a small canyon where an overhang provided some shelter. The horse needed rest, and so did the girl, though she showed no signs of fatigue. "Eat," Buck said, offering her a strip of jerky. "Need strength." She hesitated, then took the dried meat, chewing slowly while her eyes never left his face. "Water in canteen," he added, "small sips." After eating in silence, Buck studied the stars, calculating their position. They'd need to reach Santiago's place by tomorrow evening. Any later, and they risked being caught in open country. The girl suddenly tensed, her head turning sharply to the west. Buck followed her gaze and spotted it. Distant torchlight, moving in groups of 3 or 4. Patrols. "Army patrol," Buck whispered. "We go around, stay in shadows." She nodded, already on her feet and ready to move. Her adaptability impressed him. She'd clearly survived worse than a hard night's ride. As Buck helped her back onto the horse, her small hand briefly gripped his forearm, not for balance, but in what felt almost like reassurance. Then it was gone, and her face resumed its careful blankness. The connection, however brief, stayed with Buck as they resumed their journey, following the stars southward through the unforgiving landscape. Santiago Mendoza didn't ask questions. That's why men like Buck trusted him. His remote blacksmith shop sat in a narrow valley just north of the Mexican border, the perfect location for a man whose business often straddled the line between legal and questionable. The forge's heat hit them as they approached, a welcome change from the morning chill. Santiago looked up from his anvil, hammer pausing mid-strike as he registered Buck's appearance and the Apache child with him. "Madre de Dios," Santiago muttered, setting down his hammer. Buck Wyatt with an Apache girl. The world truly is ending. Buck dismounted, helping the girl down before approaching his old acquaintance. "Need papers. Safe route south." Santiago wiped sweat from his brow, dark eyes evaluating the situation. "An Apache girl? With soldiers hunting her? You've found trouble, amigo." "Worth the risk," Buck replied, pulling silver coins from his pouch. "Papers I can forge. Safety." Santiago shook his head. "That costs more." Buck placed additional silver on the workbench. "Worth every penny." Santiago nodded, accepting the payment, but his expression remained troubled. "There are stories about Hollister. They say he hunts specific Apache families. Personal vengeance." The girl's eyes darted up at the mention of Hollister's name, the first reaction Buck had seen from her since leaving the ranch. "The girl knows something Hollister doesn't want known," Buck said quietly. "Found her with his brass buttons in her hand." Santiago crossed himself. "Then you are both already dead if caught. Come inside, quickly." He led them into the back room of the forge, away from prying eyes. The girl stayed close to Buck, her shoulder nearly touching his leg as they walked. "I can have papers ready by nightfall," Santiago said. "But helping an Apache marks you as a traitor to many, my friend. The price on both your heads will be higher than you imagine." The bounty notice carried Hollister's signature, and a lie so blatant it made Buck's blood boil. Santiago spread the paper on his workbench, alongside several other documents he'd collected about Hollister's activities. "Murder of Private James Reynolds," Buck read aloud, his voice tight. $500 for information leading to capture of Apache female child approximately 10 to 12 years old. Santiago nodded grimly. "Reynolds was found with a knife in his back 3 days ago. Convenient timing, no?" The girl had positioned herself near the workbench's edge, watching intently as they examined the papers. When Buck looked up, he found her staring not at the bounty notice, but at the map spread beside it. "She understands more than she lets on," Santiago observed. Buck followed her gaze to where Hollister's patrol routes were marked in red ink. "What else have you heard about Hollister's operations?" Santiago retrieved a worn journal from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. "This was brought to me by a Mexican trader. Found it on a dead man, an army deserter." He opened the book to reveal a detailed account of military operations, including coordinates and dates. These locations match Apache settlements that were reportedly raided by hostiles. But the dates... "The attacks came after the army visits," Buck finished, the pattern becoming clear. "See, this girl, she witnessed something. No, something Hollister cannot allow to be known. A massacre, unauthorized." Buck looked at the brass buttons he'd kept from the girl's hand. "Military buttons, when I found her." Santiago's expression darkened as he pulled out another document. Buck's old service papers. "Your service papers identify you as former scout. If caught helping her..." "I know the penalty," Buck said grimly. The girl suddenly moved, reaching for a piece of charcoal beside the forge. Before either man could stop her, she drew a crude but recognizable map on a scrap of paper, a river, mountains, and a circle marking a location Buck instantly recognized. "Whitewater Canyon," he breathed. "That's where your family was camped?" She nodded once, then made a sweeping gesture with her hands, followed by dropping her head in a simulation of sleep. Then she drew a line of stick figures with guns. "They came at night," Buck translated. "When everyone was sleeping." Her dark eyes met his, and for the first time, Buck saw not just wariness, but a plea for understanding. Santiago watched the exchange with growing concern. The price on the girl's head is high, but the cost of compassion will be even higher. Morning light revealed the distant ribbon of green that marked the Rio Grande. Buck and the girl had ridden through the night, following Santiago's directions along game trails and dry washes where pursuing horses would leave clear tracks. "Water by midday," Buck said, pointing toward the river valley. "Then Mexico." The girl, who Buck now knew was called Niol in her own language, though she hadn't spoken it aloud, studied the landscape with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading nature's signs. She pointed to a dust cloud far to the east. Buck nodded grimly. "Hollister's men." Moving fast. They'd left Santiago's forge just before dawn with forged papers identifying Buck as John Smith, a widower traveling with his daughter Sarah. Santiago had warned that such papers might not hold up to close scrutiny, but they could buy precious time if needed. As they rode, Buck found himself explaining their route, pointing out landmarks, and sharing knowledge he'd gained during his scouting days. "River's low this time of year. We'll cross at Broken Rock. Currents gentler there." Niol listened attentively, occasionally indicating her understanding with slight nods. Though she remained silent, her awareness had become a form of communication between them, a rustling branch that caught her attention, a subtle shift when she sensed wildlife nearby. "You know this land better than I do," Buck admitted, after she'd guided them around a rattlesnake den he hadn't noticed. "Your people have been here far longer than mine." For the briefest moment, something like approval flickered in her eyes. They stopped in the shadow of a sandstone formation to rest the horse and eat. Buck shared the last of the jerky Santiago had provided, watching as Niol carefully tucked a portion away for later, the habit of someone who knew hunger well. "We'll reach the river by sundown," Buck said, studying the terrain ahead. "Cross at first light tomorrow, when the water's coldest and the mist provides cover." Niol suddenly stiffened, her head turning sharply westward. Buck followed her gaze but saw nothing. Then he heard it, the faint but unmistakable sound of horses approaching, still out of sight, but moving in their direction. "Scouts," Buck whispered. "We've been flanked." The narrow box canyon wasn't Buck's first choice for a defensive position, but it offered the only available cover. Sheer rock walls rose on three sides, with their back to a steep slope that might be climbable in an emergency. "Stay here," Buck instructed, positioning Niol in a natural alcove formed by fallen rocks. "Don't move unless I call you." He unsaddled their exhausted horse, removing anything that might make noise, then led the animal deeper into the canyon where it would be hidden from immediate view. Returning to the entrance, Buck began setting a trap with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done this before. Scattered rocks became trip hazards at the canyon's mouth. His canteen, carefully positioned, would look like a hastily abandoned camp. And most importantly, his boot prints led visibly into the canyon, but not out, a trail too obvious to ignore. Niol watched his preparations, then silently began gathering small stones of her own, placing them within easy reach of her hiding spot. Buck nodded in approval. She understood what was coming. Taking position on a ledge above the canyon entrance, Buck checked his Winchester one last time. 6 rounds in the rifle, 12 more in his belt, plus the 6 in his Colt. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to create confusion and an opportunity to escape. The sun beat down mercilessly as they waited, the canyon heating like an oven. Minutes stretched into an hour, silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then came the sounds they'd been dreading, horses approaching at a walk, men's voices low but carrying in the desert air. "Tracks lead this way," a gruff voice announced. "Fresh, can't be more than an hour ahead." "Wyatt knows these lands," another replied. $500, says he's heading for the border. Captain's offering twice that now, plus army bounty. That's 2,000 for the girl, 500 for Wyatt, dead or alive. Buck's jaw tightened. The price had indeed gone up, just as Santiago had warned. He glanced at Niole, finding her completely still, only her eyes moving as she tracked the sounds outside. 3 riders came into view at the canyon entrance, their horses nervous in the confined space. 2 wore civilian clothes, bounty hunters by the look of them, while the third wore the dusty blue uniform of the cavalry. Buck took a slow, steady breath, finger resting beside the trigger. Not yet. Let them come further in. The first shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Buck's bullet struck rock just above the lead rider's head, sending stone fragments flying. The men scattered instantly, diving for cover as their horses reared in panic. "It's an ambush!" the soldier shouted, scrambling behind a boulder. Buck fired twice more in rapid succession, keeping the men pinned while focusing on their abandoned horses. A well-placed shot near the animals sent them bolting from the canyon, disappearing into the desert with empty saddles. Return fire ricocheted off the canyon walls, forcing Buck to duck behind the ledge. The bounty hunters were working to flank his position, one moving along each wall while the soldier provided covering fire. "Wyatt," one of the men called out, "we know you've got the Apache girl. Hand her over and you might live to see sundown." Buck responded with another shot, catching the speaker in the shoulder and spinning him into the dirt. From her hidden position, Niole suddenly launched her gathered stones with deadly accuracy, striking the second bounty hunter in the face. The momentary distraction was all Buck needed to put a bullet in the man's thigh, effectively taking him out of the fight. The soldier, now alone and outmatched, began a desperate retreat toward the canyon entrance. "You're making a mistake, Wyatt. Captain Hollister will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this." "Tell Hollister he'll need to send more men next time," Buck shouted back, providing covering fire as Niole scrambled up the slope toward him. They had to move quickly. The gunfire would attract any other patrols in the area, and the wounded men wouldn't die from their injuries. Retrieving their horse, Buck helped Niole into the saddle before mounting behind her. Instead of returning to the canyon entrance where they might be seen, Buck guided the horse up a game trail at the back of the canyon, steep and dangerous, but their only chance at escape. "Hold tight," he murmured, as the horse picked its way carefully up the rocky incline. Behind them, the wounded bounty hunter's voice carried up the canyon. "You're dead, Wyatt. You hear me? Dead." They reached the river as the sun was setting, but the brief victory of making it to the crossing point was overshadowed by the warm wetness spreading across Buck's side. Sometime during their escape, a bullet had found its mark, a deep graze along his ribs that he'd been too focused to notice until now. "Not serious," he told Niole as he slid from the saddle, but his legs betrayed him, buckling as he hit the ground. The girl was instantly beside him, small hands examining the wound with surprising confidence. She tore strips from her own clothing to bind the injury, her movements quick and precise. "Need to cross," Buck insisted, trying to stand. "They'll have more men coming." Niole pressed firmly on his shoulders, pushing him back down with a decisive shake of her head. The message was clear. He wasn't going anywhere in this condition. Night fell, bringing with it a fever that sent Buck drifting between consciousness and delirious dreams. Fragments of his past mingled with the present, Apache villages burning, women and children fleeing, Hollister's cold orders to leave no witnesses. Do-dia, do-dia, Buck muttered in Apache, the phrases coming unbidden from his scouting days. I'm sorry. I didn't stop it. Through the haze, he was vaguely aware of Niole gathering plants along the riverbank, grinding leaves into a paste that she applied to his wound. The bitter smell cleared his head momentarily, enough to see the girl watching him with an intensity that went beyond concern. You understand me, Buck whispered, realization dawning through the fever. You understood everything I've said. The first sound he heard from her lips was so unexpected that Buck thought he might still be dreaming. Shizé, she said softly, Father, her hand resting briefly on his forehead. Before Buck could respond, darkness claimed him again, fever dreams pulling him under. This time, though, the nightmares were held at bay by the strange comfort of that single word, and the small hand that remained steadfast on his brow through the long desert night. When morning light finally broke through his fever, Buck awoke to find himself alone, the makeshift camp eerily silent. Niole was gone. Panic surged through him as he struggled to sit up, wound protesting with sharp pain. Had she abandoned him? Been captured? His bleary eyes scanned the river bank desperately. Then he saw her, not fleeing, but returning from the brush with a desert hare, freshly killed. She hadn't abandoned him. She'd been hunting for food. Their eyes met across the campsite, and for the first time since he'd cut her from the hanging tree, Niole's face softened into what might have been the beginning of a smile. Buck's wound worsened despite Niole's herbal treatments. By the second day after the firefight, the skin around the bullet graze had turned an angry red, hot to the touch. The fever returned each night, leaving him shivering despite the desert heat. We need to find better shelter, Buck muttered, struggling to mount his horse after a brief rest. The river crossing lay behind them now, but Mexico's promise of safety remained days away across unforgiving terrain. Niole had remained vigilant, her newfound voice used sparingly but deliberately. "Soldiers!" she would warn when dust clouds appeared on the horizon, or water when she spotted hidden springs Buck's feverish eyes missed. By midday, Buck could barely stay upright in the saddle. The infection was spreading, and they both knew it. When Niole suddenly changed their direction, heading east instead of south, Buck lacked the strength to question her. "Know where going?" he managed to ask, as the horse picked its way through scrubby vegetation. "Healer," Niole replied, the word carefully formed. "Woman who knows plants." Buck wanted to argue. Any delay increased their risk of capture, but the fire in his side had become unbearable. They needed help, or he wouldn't make it to Mexico at all. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, rocky outcroppings giving way to scattered juniper trees. In the distance, a thin wisp of smoke rose from what appeared to be a small canyon. Niole guided them toward the smoke with quiet confidence. As they drew closer, Buck made out a modest dwelling built partially into the hillside, its adobe walls blending with the natural stone. A woman emerged from the doorway before they reached the house, as if she'd been expecting visitors. She stood straight-backed despite her apparent age, her long silver-streaked hair braided and wrapped with strips of red cloth. Her face bore the deep lines of someone who had spent a lifetime in the sun, and her eyes held the sharp clarity of a hawk's. "Sarah Two Moons," Buck whispered in recognition, his heart sinking. The half-Apache healer was known throughout the territory for her knowledge of traditional medicine, and for her fierce hatred of the soldiers who had massacred her mother's people. She would recognize him, and she would have every reason to turn him away, or worse. "So the scout returns," Sarah Two Moons said in perfect English. her voice carrying the cadence of both her worlds, wounded, hunted, and with an Apache child in tow. Her dark eyes moved from Buck to Neol, communicating silently in a way Buck couldn't interpret. Neol straightened on the horse, responding in rapid Apache that Buck only partially understood, words for hanging, soldiers, and buttons filtering through his fever-addled mind. Sarah listened without interruption, then turned her attention back to Buck. "You were with Hollister's unit 3 years ago at Whitewater Canyon." It wasn't a question, but Buck nodded weakly. "Left after—" I couldn't stomach it. "Leaving is not the same as stopping," Sarah replied, her tone cutting. 23 dead, including this child's family. Buck swayed in the saddle, darkness encroaching at the edges of his vision. Didn't know what was planned. Thought it was peaceful relocation. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "There is nothing peaceful about Hollister, or those who served him." Neol suddenly spoke again, her small voice insistent as she gestured toward Buck's wound. The two exchanged more words in Apache, their conversation growing heated. "The child says you saved her," Sarah finally said to Buck, "that you cut her from the hanging tree when others would have left her to die." Buck met her eyes, despite the pain radiating through his body. "Doesn't erase what came before." "No," Sarah agreed, "it does not." For a long moment she seemed to weigh something in her mind, her gaze shifting between Buck's wound and Neol's determined face. Finally, she stepped aside from her doorway. "Bring him inside," she instructed Neol. "The fever has nearly claimed him. I make no promises, but I will try." As Neol helped Buck from the horse, he found himself face to face with Sarah. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Not for you, Scout," she replied coldly. "For the child who believes you worth saving, though the Great Spirit alone knows why." Buck awakened to the smell of burning sage and the sound of low voices. The pain in his side had dulled to a persistent throb, and the fog of fever had lifted enough for him to take in his surroundings. He lay on a narrow pallet in Sarah Two Moon's one-room dwelling, surrounded by hanging bundles of dried plants and shelves lined with clay pots. Neol sat cross-legged nearby, watching as Sarah ground something in a stone mortar. They spoke softly in Apache, falling silent when they noticed Buck's open eyes. "The infection runs deep," Sarah informed him, approaching with a steaming clay cup. "Drink this, all of it." The bitter liquid burned Buck's throat, but he forced it down under Sarah's watchful eye. When he finished, she checked his bandages with efficient movements that betrayed neither gentleness nor cruelty, simply the practiced hands of a healer. "Why is Hollister hunting the girl?" Sarah asked as she applied a pungent paste to his wound. Buck winced at the sting. "She witnessed something at Whitewater Canyon, something he can't afford to have known." Sarah's hands paused momentarily. "The massacre was 3 years ago." "She kept evidence," Buck explained. "Brass buttons from Hollister's uniform. Must have been hiding all this time, until recently." Sarah and Neol exchanged glances, some unspoken understanding passing between them. "Rest," Sarah finally said, rising to her feet. "I must gather more herbs before nightfall." Buck nodded gratefully, already feeling the medicine pulling him back toward sleep. He caught Neol's eye as his lids grew heavy. "Thank you," he murmured, "for finding help." The ghost of a smile touched her lips before darkness claimed him again. When Buck next awoke, the hut was silent and filled with long afternoon shadows. He pushed himself to a sitting position, surprised at the strength that had returned to his limbs. The wound still hurt, but the burning infection had receded. "Neol!" he called, but received no answer. Outside, he heard the approach of horses, multiple riders moving quickly. Buck's heart raced as he struggled to his feet, reaching instinctively for his gun belt, only to find it missing. Through the small window, he spotted Sarah Two Moons walking purposefully away from the hut toward the main trail. There was no sign of Neol. Cold realization washed over him. Sarah had sent word to town, perhaps to collect the bounty herself, or simply to rid the world of one more white soldier. Either way, Buck had been betrayed, and Neol along with him. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Buck searched the hut for his weapons. His rifle was gone, but he found his Colt hidden beneath the pallet where he'd slept, overlooked, or perhaps deliberately left by Sarah. The riders were getting closer. Buck checked the revolver, still loaded with all 6 rounds. Not enough to fight off what sounded like a full patrol, but enough to make a stand. Buck positioned himself by the doorway, gun ready. He wouldn't abandon Neol. Not again. Whatever his past sins, he would not compound them by running now. Sometimes mercy comes from the most unlikely places, Buck thought grimly as he prepared to face whatever came through that door. Buck braced himself as the door swung open, finger tensing on the trigger. Instead of soldiers, however, the figure that stepped through was Marshal Robert Dawson, territorial lawman and the closest thing to a friend Buck had left from his former life. "Wyatt," Dawson nodded, holstering his own weapon upon seeing Buck's. "You look terrible." Buck kept his revolver trained on the doorway. "Where's the girl? Where's Sarah?" "The healer's showing my deputy where to position lookouts," Dawson explained calmly. "The Apache child is with her. Nobody's been betrayed here, Buck." Buck lowered his gun slightly, confusion evident on his face. "You're not here for the bounty?" "I'm here because Sarah Two Moons sent word that Captain Hollister is conducting unauthorized manhunts in my territory," Dawson said, his weathered face hardening. "And because I've been gathering evidence on Hollister's activities for the past year." From his coat, Dawson withdrew a leather folio filled with papers. Testimonials from settlers about midnight raids blamed on Apaches. Military supply requisitions that don't match official operations. Reports of Mexican villages across the border being attacked by unknown assailants with Army-issue weapons. Buck sank back onto the pallet, the adrenaline draining from his body. Whitewater Canyon wasn't the only massacre. "Not by a long shot," Dawson confirmed grimly. "Hollister's been running his own private war against specific Apache bands for years. The girl you saved, she's from the family that supposedly killed his wife and child during a raid in '65, eh? But they didn't," Buck guessed. "No. I've found witnesses who place Hollister's family at a trading post when it was attacked by Mexican bandits, not Apaches. He's been using Army resources to pursue a personal vendetta based on a lie." The door opened again, admitting Sarah and Neol. The girl immediately moved to Buck's side, her small hand touching his arm in what seemed like reassurance. "You thought I had betrayed you," Sarah stated, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Buck nodded once. "I apologize." "No need," she replied. "In your place, I would have assumed the same." Neol spoke rapidly in Apache to Sarah, who translated. "She says you fought the fever all night calling her name, that you were ready to die protecting her." Buck met Neol's eyes, seeing in them a trust he hadn't earned, but somehow had been given nonetheless. "What happens now, Marshal?" Dawson's expression grew serious. "Officially, I can't help you. Hollister outranks me, and the Army backs him. Unofficially," he glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly, "we're getting you both to Mexico tonight." Maps and papers covered the small table in Sarah's hut as the unlikely allies formulated their escape plan. Marshal Dawson had brought detailed information about Army patrol routes and checkpoint locations, while Sarah contributed her knowledge of hidden trails used by her mother's people for generations. Hollister has men watching all the main crossing points, Dawson explained, tracing lines along the border. But there's a canyon here, Los Diablos, rarely used because of the difficult terrain. And the spirits that guard it, Sarah added, her expression grave. Buck studied the route. 3 days hard ride in our condition. 2 if you push it, Dawson countered. My deputy will spread word that you were spotted heading west toward California. Should buy you some time. Santiago Mendoza arrived as sunset approached, his appearance surprising Buck. The blacksmith set a bundle on the table, fresh supplies, ammunition, and updated papers. You didn't think I would abandon friends, did you? Santiago asked with a wry smile. Besides, Hollister's men ransacked my forge. I have my own reasons to see Mexico now. Together they planned each stage of the journey, water sources, alternate routes if pursued, emergency meeting points if separated. Buck noticed that Niol followed every detail intently, occasionally correcting their plans with gestures toward better paths or hidden dangers she seemed to instinctively understand. The girl knows this land, Sarah observed. Her mother's family were pathfinders for the Apache, guides who could find water in stone and safety in the most dangerous places. Will she be safe in Mexico? Buck asked quietly, while Niol studied the maps with Santiago. Sarah's expression softened slightly. There are Apache bands across the border who would take her in, but I do not think that is what she wants anymore. Buck looked questioningly at her. She has chosen you, Sarah said simply, for reasons I do not fully understand but must respect. Marshal Dawson interrupted with final instructions. Once you cross into Mexico, head for San Miguel. I have contacts there who can help you disappear. Hollister won't risk an international incident by pursuing you openly. And the evidence against him? Buck asked. I'm compiling it for the territorial governor, Dawson replied. It will take time, but eventually justice will catch up to Hollister. Buck nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Justice would come too late for him to ever return home. The final preparations were completed as night fell. They would leave before dawn, traveling under cover of darkness until they reached the canyon. Buck checked and rechecked their supplies, his movements betraying the anxiety he felt about the journey ahead. Niol approached as he was adjusting the saddlebags, holding something in her small hand. When she opened her palm, Buck saw a carved wooden amulet on a leather cord. Protection, she said softly, offering it to him. Buck hesitated before carefully taking the amulet. Thank you. Niol watched as he examined it, then pointed to herself. Niol. That's your name? Niol? Buck asked, understanding dawning. She nodded, then pointed to Buck. Shije, father. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Buck swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. From his pocket, he withdrew a small silver locket, his dead wife's only remaining possession. He'd carried it for years as a reminder of everything he'd lost. Now he opened it, showing Niol the faded photograph inside. My wife, Catherine, he explained. She died before I met you. Fever took her. Carefully, he placed the locket in Niol's hand, closing her fingers around it. Family, he said simply. Niol clutched the locket to her chest, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Then, in a gesture that took Buck completely by surprise, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. Buck stood frozen for a moment before his arms came around her small shoulders, protective and gentle. They remained that way until Sarah called them inside for a final meal before their journey. As they gathered around Sarah's table, Buck, Neole, Santiago, Marshal Dawson, and Sarah herself, Buck was struck by the strangeness of their unlikely alliance. A former military scout, an Apache child, a Mexican blacksmith with questionable business practices, a territorial lawman, and a half-Apache healer, all united against a common enemy. The conversation was sparse, each person lost in their own thoughts about the dangerous journey ahead. Neole, however, seemed strangely at peace, occasionally meeting Buck's eyes with a quiet confidence that steadied his own nerves. Their meal was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Sarah's lookout, a young Apache man who burst through the door with urgent news. "Riders approaching from the north," he reported in rapid Apache, which Sarah translated. "Many men. Hollister leads them." Dawson moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "They've found us. Must have tortured one of Santiago's contacts." Buck exchanged a look with Neole, who was already on her feet, gathering their essential supplies. Time had run out. The reckoning would come here now. The abandoned mission rose from the desert like the skeleton of a long-dead giant, its adobe walls crumbling beneath a bell tower that had survived a century of harsh sun and violent storms. Buck guided their small party through the ruins with the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated battlefields before. "Sarah and Santiago, take the bell tower," he instructed. "Best vantage point. Marshal, the south wall has good cover and clear lines of sight to the approach." Dawson nodded grimly, checking his rifle. "Hollister has at least 20 men. We're outnumbered 5-1. "But we have position," Buck countered, ushering Neole toward the old chapel. "And we only need to hold out until dawn. The border's less than 3 miles south." They had fled Sarah's dwelling just minutes before Hollister's men arrived, using a hidden arroyo that circled behind the approaching force. The mission hadn't been their planned destination, but when their horses began to falter, Buck had made the decision to stand and fight rather than be caught in open terrain. Inside the chapel, Buck knelt before Neole, meeting her eyes directly. "Stay hidden, no matter what happens. If things go wrong, there's a tunnel beneath the altar that leads to a spring outside the walls. Santiago knows to look for you there if we get separated." Neole shook her head firmly, pulling a small knife from her belt, Sarah's parting gift. "Stay with you," she said, her voice quiet but determined. Buck wanted to argue, to insist she remain safely hidden, but the resolute expression on her young face stopped him. She had survived 3 years on her own after witnessing her family's massacre. She would not hide now. "Together, then," he conceded, positioning them behind a half-wall with clear sight of the entrance, but protected from direct fire. Outside, the first pink light of dawn illuminated dust clouds approaching from the north. Hoofbeats echoed across the desert floor like distant thunder. "Here they come," Santiago called from the bell tower. "Hollister in front, military and civilians together." Buck checked his Winchester one last time, then glanced at Neole beside him. Her face was composed, showing neither fear nor hesitation. Something tight in his chest loosened at the sight. Whatever happened in the next hour, he would not fail her again. "Remember," he called to the others, "Hollister is the target. Without him, the others may stand down." The riders approached within 200 yards of the mission before halting. Through the chapel doorway, Buck could make out Captain Hollister at the front of the formation, his uniform pristine despite the dusty journey. "Buck Wyatt," Hollister's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Surrender the Apache girl, and you'll receive a fair trial." Buck exchanged glances with Marshal Dawson across the courtyard. They both knew exactly how fair Hollister's justice would be. "That offer expired at Whitewater Canyon 3 years ago, Captain," Buck shouted back. "We know what you've done." A tense silence followed, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses. Then Hollister's cold voice. "Take them. The girl alive if possible. No one else matters." The first volley of gunfire shattered the dawn quiet, bullets splintering ancient wood and crumbling adobe as the battle for the mission began. For 20 minutes, the mission echoed with gunfire and shouted commands. Hollister's men had surrounded the ruins, but were hesitant to charge directly into the defenders' carefully positioned crossfire. 2 soldiers lay motionless in the courtyard, testimony to Sarah's deadly accuracy from the bell tower. Buck and Niall remained behind their wall, conserving ammunition and firing only when targets presented clear opportunities. Through gaps in the wall, Buck watched Hollister directing his men with growing frustration. "They're moving to the south side," Santiago warned from above, "trying to flank the marshal's position." Buck caught Dawson's eye across the courtyard and signaled toward the chapel's rear exit. The marshal nodded, understanding the silent instruction to fall back and reposition. A sudden crash from the bell tower drew all eyes upward. One of Hollister's men had managed to reach the base of the structure and had thrown a lit torch through its open window. Flames quickly took hold in the dry, aged wood. "Sarah! Santiago!" "Get out now!" Buck shouted as smoke began to pour from the tower. Niall tugged urgently at Buck's sleeve, pointing toward movement at the chapel's side entrance, soldiers attempting to circle behind them. "Go," Buck urged, guiding her toward the altar. "Use the tunnel. I'll hold them here." For once, Niall didn't argue, slipping toward the hidden passage as Buck positioned himself to cover her retreat. He fired twice at the side entrance, forcing the approaching soldiers to take cover. The distraction cost him. Buck turned at the sound of boots on stone to find Captain Hollister himself standing in the main doorway, revolver aimed directly at Buck's chest. "Wyatt," Hollister said coldly, his steel-gray eyes taking in the scene. "Still protecting savages, I see." Buck kept his rifle steady, creating a standoff. "The only savage I see wears a uniform." Hollister's thin lips curved in a smile that never reached his eyes. "Where's the girl?" "The witness to your imagined crimes?" "Safe from you," Buck replied. "And the crimes aren't imagined. Marshal Dawson has collected testimonies from 12 witnesses, papers signed by your own hand ordering attacks on peaceful settlements." Something flashed across Hollister's face, uncertainty, perhaps even fear. It vanished quickly, replaced by cold calculation. "Those Apaches killed my family," Hollister said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "Everything I've done for justice." "It was Mexican bandits at the trading post," Buck countered. "You've known that for years. You created a lie to justify your revenge." Hollister's face contorted with fury. "They're all the same, animals who needed to be put down. That girl is the last of them, the last who knows what really happened." "And what did happen, Captain?" Buck asked, deliberately drawing him out, buying time for Niall to escape. "I did what the army didn't have the stomach to do," Hollister snarled. "Those people at Whitewater were harboring raiders. The girl's uncle led attacks on 3 settlements. There were women and children in that camp," Buck said quietly. "Sleeping families." "Collateral damage," Hollister dismissed with a wave of his free hand. "Necessary for the greater peace." From the shadows behind the altar, a small voice spoke clearly. "You killed my mother while she begged for mercy." Hollister's head whipped toward the sound, his gun following instinctively. Buck lunged forward, tackling the captain to the ground as both their weapons discharged, the shots deafeningly loud within the chapel walls. Buck's ears rang from the gunfire as he struggled with Hollister on the chapel floor. The captain fought with desperate strength, driving a knee into Buck's wounded side that sent pain lancing through his body. Buck's rifle had skittered away in the fall, leaving him only his fists against Hollister's fury. A blow to the jaw snapped Buck's head back, momentarily stunning him. Hollister used the advantage to reach for his fallen revolver, fingers closing around the grip as he rolled away. "Die with your Apache friends," Hollister spat, raising the gun toward Buck's face. The shot that rang out came not from Hollister's revolver, but from Marshal Dawson's, who appeared in the doorway with perfect timing. The bullet struck Hollister's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild into the ceiling. Buck scrambled to his feet, kicking Hollister's weapon away and pinning the wounded officer to the ground. Outside, the sound of gunfire had diminished, suggesting the tide had turned against Hollister's men. "It's over, Captain," Dawson said, approaching with his gun still trained on Hollister. "Your men are surrendering." Hollister's face twisted with hatred. "This isn't justice. That child is the enemy." "No," Buck said quietly. "She's just a girl who survived your massacre. The only enemy here is a man who betrayed his oath and used his uniform to pursue personal vengeance." With Dawson covering him, Buck retrieved a length of rope from his saddlebag and bound Hollister's hands. The captain continued to curse and threaten, but his words held no power now, just the desperate raving of a man facing the collapse of his carefully constructed justifications. Niole emerged from behind the altar, approaching cautiously until she stood before the restrained captain. Her small face showed neither hatred nor fear, only a calm certainty that surprised Buck. "I forgive you," she said, in careful English, each word deliberate. "Not for you, for me." Hollister stared at her in disbelief, then turned away, unable to face the simple dignity of the child he had tried so hard to destroy. Buck placed a gentle hand on Niole's shoulder. "Are you ready to go?" She nodded, looking up at him with trust that still humbled him. "Marshal?" Buck questioned, gesturing toward Hollister. Dawson nodded grimly. "I'll see he faces a military tribunal. Santiago and Sarah have agreed to testify." He hesitated, then added, "You could return too, Buck, with witness protection." "No," Buck interrupted gently. "Our path lies south now." As dawn fully broke over the desert, Buck and Niole rode away from the mission, leaving behind the echoes of gunfire and the ghosts of the past. Sarah and Santiago had already departed for their own destinations, their unlikely alliance dissolved now that its purpose was fulfilled. 4 months later, the small adobe house sat beside a clear river, sheltered by cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade in the Mexican heat. Buck worked steadily, fitting a wooden cradle together from pieces he'd shaped over the past weeks. Some of the wood had come with them from New Mexico, taken from the hanging tree where he'd found Niole, now transformed from an instrument of death into a promise of new life. Niole approached from the garden she tended, her step slower now as her pregnancy advanced. She carried a basket of vegetables, her face peaceful in a way Buck had once thought impossible. "Shijeye," she called, using the name that had evolved from formal title to term of endearment. "Santiago is coming, bringing news." Buck set aside his tools and stood, shading his eyes to spot the familiar figure approaching on horseback. Santiago visited every few weeks, bringing supplies and information from across the border. "Marshal Dawson sends his regards," Santiago announced later as they shared a meal in the cool evening air. Hollister's trial concluded, guilty on all charges. Buck nodded, feeling not satisfaction, but a quiet closing of a chapter. "And the others?" "Sarah has returned to her healing." The marshal continues his work. Santiago smiled, raising his cup in a toast. And here, new life grows where hate once tried to destroy it. Niole placed a hand on her growing belly, where the child she carried, conceived in violence before Buck had found her, would be born into love rather than hatred. The sign had read, "White man don't forgive," Buck reflected quietly. But we found something stronger than vengeance. Niole reached across the table to take his hand. "Family," she said simply. As the sun set over their new home, the hanging tree wood in the cradle caught the last golden light, transformed like them into something meant for life rather than death. Buck Wyatt, once a man haunted by his failure to protect the innocent, now sat surrounded by the family he had found in the most unexpected place, at the foot of a hanging tree in the New Mexico desert.